All right, so starting with the first problem, there are two different ways that you can approach it. So anytime they give you a question with some sort of equation and 4 answers, you can always plug all 4 answers in and figure out which one works. But it can be time consuming, so that's kind of a last resort if you can't figure out another way. It's an easier way and a quicker way to figure this out. So the first thing you do is write the proportion that they give you. And then I went on ahead and plugged in 40 for W because they told us that the width was 40. All right, and now we're looking for L. So the first thing you want to do whenever you have a proportion is cross multiply so that you can get an equation without fractions. And when I did that, I have L times L minus 40 right here. And then I have 40 times 40, which is 40 squared right here. And then I just simplified. So you end up with L squared, L times L minus 40L is equal to 1600. All right, so now that you see you got a variable with a square, you realize this is a quadratic function. So that means anytime you have a quadratic function, you can either factor by finding the two roots, or you can just plug the A, B, and C into the quadratic formula. This is pretty, if you're not familiar or confident with this, I would get familiar with it because it's probably going to be the quickest way to kind of get through quadratic functions if you see them on the test. So basically, I put everything on one side and set it equal to 0. So I had to bring the 1600 over here. And that's why you see a negative 1600 equals 0. So I just brought the L squared down, minus 40L, minus 1600 equals 0. So this is the equation that we're going to be using to solve for L. All right. Now, when you use the quadratic formula, here's what it is. And then you got your A, B, and your C. So your A is the coefficient in front of this first thing, which is going to be a 1 because there's nothing there. Our B is going to be negative 40, and our C is going to be negative 1600. So now I'm going to plug this into the quadratic formula. Right, so here's where I plugged in my B for B, which was negative 40. And don't forget there's a negative outside there in the formula, so that's why I got those two negatives. Then I plug in B again, minus 4AC, and that whole product is what we're subtracting. So that's why I put out that in brackets. So you got 4 times A, which is 1, times C, which is negative 1600, all over 2 times A, which is 2 times 1. And really, I just keep bringing these down. I went on and simplified and made that a positive 40. And I keep bringing my 2 down until I get all the way to the end. So negative 40 squared is equal to 1600. And then this negative and that negative is going to end up making this a positive. 4 times 1600 is 6400. So you end up with the square root of 8000. That doesn't break down evenly, but it does break down into 40 root 5. So you end up with 40 plus or minus 40 root 5 over 2, which simplifies to 20 plus or minus 20 root 5, because you can do 40 divided by 2 here and 40 divided by 2 here. You cannot do root 5 divided by 2 because it's under the radical. So that's how we end up with this. So your answer choices actually include 20 plus 20 root 5 and 20 minus 20 root 5. So that's where you may have to play around and plug them into the proportion to see which one works. But again, at least you don't have to plug all 4 of them in. So you kind of narrowed it down. And anytime you work with volume, length, width, and any of that stuff, I always start with positive, because a lot of times negative just doesn't make sense. Because most of the time you can't have like a negative area or something like that. And so I'm going to plug in 20 plus 20 root 5 and make sure that's right. So remember, here's the proportion that we started with. So I just plugged in 20 plus 20 root 5 over the 40 that they gave us. And I said, is that equal to 40 over 20 plus 20 root 5 minus 40? So I'm literally just plugging in that L and that W into this proportion right here. So again, I'm going to cross multiply once I simplify, just to see if these two things are equal. So if I can simplify, remember in the quadratic formula how we were able to divide by that too? Same thing here, 20 over 40 and 20 over 40. That'll be 1 over 2 both times. So I got a 1 over 2, and then there's a 1 in front of this root 5 over 2. And if that's confusing, you could just kind of look at it as everything on the top can be divided by 20 and everything on the bottom can be divided by 20. So 20 divided by 20 is 1. 20 root 5 divided by 20 is 1 root 5. And then 40 divided by 20 is 2. Same thing on this side. You got a 40, a 20, a 20, and a 40. And I can divide all those by 20 to simplify. So I'm actually going to break this down with you. So here I got the 20 and the 20 and the 40. They can all be divided by 20. So 20 divided by 20 would give me a 1. And 20 divided by 20 here will also give me a 1. So that's 1 root 5. And you really don't need that 1. So I'm going to erase that. And then 40 divided by 20 would give me 2. Okay. And then on this side, and I want to say still, is this equal to? 40 divided by 20 will give me a 2 on the top. 20 divided by 20 will give me a 1. 20 divided by 20 here is going to be a plus just a root 5. And then minus 40 divided by 20, that would just be minus 2. So right now from here, that's what I have simplified. So again, we have another proportion, but before I cross multiply to see if those two things are equal, I'm going to simplify this one right here, because this denominator says 1 plus this minus 2. So a negative 2 and a positive 1 is going to leave me with a negative 1. So instead of having this, I'm now going to have this. Okay? Because I had the negative 2 and a positive 1. So from here, I can cross multiply. So 2 times 2 will give me 4. And then 1 plus root 5 and root 5 minus 1. I'm just going to FOIL those. And when I FOIL them, I get 1 times root 5, which is root 5. And then I get outside 1 times negative 1. It would be negative 1. Inside, root 5 times root 5 would just be 5. And then last, root 5 times negative 1, it will be negative root 5. So my root 5s are going to cancel out, and I'm left with 5 minus 1, or negative 1 plus 5, which is 4. So I know that that answer is correct.